I was really hoping to save my primos during this patch in preparation for the thundering seamstress Chiori, but I made the mistake of watching Xianyun's collected miscellany where Dine's Life mentioned she dotes on her disciples, and as someone who adores Shenhe, I was like, crap. Cloud Retainer raised her so well. Alright, time to drain my in-game savings for her. And as I was admiring Xianyun's unique personality, role, and introduction, it reminded me of my thoughts about how female characters in Genshin are typically written and how she breaks free from some of those expectations. The writing of Genshin women is a topic I've been putting off for a while now due to my lack of inspiration, but I think Xianyun helps give us a more optimistic perspective on the matter, so I feel more inclined to discuss this now. Don't worry though, my goal here is not to disparage the other female characters to uplift Xianyun, but I hope to share some of my insights on the development of female characters in the game and what storylines and characterizations involving them may look like in the future. If you find this kind of character analysis interesting, please do consider subscribing to the channel to catch other related content. And before I continue, yes, I'm pronouncing Xianyun kinda strangely because I'm trying to mimic the actual Chinese pronunciation, but I'm not sure if I'm doing it right, but I tried. Anyway, although I think this is a topic made for an entire 30-minute video in and of itself, I want to talk about some of the recurring weaknesses of Genshin women's writing that many other fans aside from myself have noticed. People do point out that there is a general trend of Genshin women presenting themselves as waifu bait, defined as a female character portrayed to be lovable and perfect to appeal to male audiences, characterized by traits such as gentleness, docility, optimism, and in this case, seemingly an over-reliance on the traveler's company or advice for personal development. However, I do think lots of these criticisms are very sweeping because it unintentionally undermines naturally feminine traits. Instead, I would specify the problem with Genshin women being that their storylines hyper-focus on these traits I mentioned earlier, even though they probably have other more interesting qualities that can be put to the forefront. A concrete example of this would be Kokomi, who is a war strategist, so realistically speaking, there probably exists a shrewd, calculating, and cutthroat side to her because ruthlessly sabotaging the enemy is kinda unavoidable in war, leading her to have a natural sense of moral ambiguity to her as she's faced with several moral dilemma in the heat of battle. However, we don't get to see this aspect of her because of how her interactions with us overemphasize her gentleness. It's not that she doesn't have other traits aside from her kindness, but this is practically the only side we see of her due to her specific involvements in battles against the shogunate's army not being detailed. Some other ways this game goes about making certain female characters seem more like quote-unquote waifus is by giving them story quests which have a date-like format where we idly hang out with the female characters for a certain part of the quest instead of focusing on a singular main problem at hand, at least not until the very end. The game also avoids allowing some of them to show certain negative emotions or perspectives aside from sadness or vulnerability. Like, there was a time when we hardly saw expressions of anger or frustration from them, or even heard them share sentiments of cynicism and things like that. Of course, gentleness, vulnerability, and optimism aren't inherently bad, but the game used to kind of limit some women to these traits, even though it might have made sense for them to snap or be more outspoken about their stances or disappointments, at least once in a while. Fans have pointed out the trend of female characters in Genshin having repetitive traits and struggles, such as the recurrence of what they call overworked waifus. However, I think it's not a bad thing for many women to struggle with overwork or loneliness, which is another common theme for female characters. It's just that the nuances of each problem have to be properly accounted for. Like, the solution to feeling overworked isn't always as simple as taking a break. The solution to loneliness is not always just being in the company of one person. And the solution to a lack of self-confidence isn't always receiving words of reassurance. It really depends on the specific situation. These personal struggles should be processed thoroughly instead of being used as easy excuses to get the traveler to spend time with female characters to satisfy some players who might be into self-inserting. So yes, while I think that some female characters in Genshin aren't inherently badly written, the circumstances that they're placed in make them come across as more shallow because they're being prevented from showcasing more interesting aspects of themselves. I think the thing that prevents some Genshin women from reaching their full potential probably has to do with the writers trying to ensure that they'll remain attractive enough for players to pull them. It's as if they're trying to avoid as many turn-offs as possible to maintain a positive image about these characters instead of allowing the players to just sit with the idea of them being imperfect. This might be why, for instance, Raiden was way too quickly redeemed by the narrative of the Inazuma Archon quest, so that her simps don't need to be bothered about politics too much while thinking about their waifu. Again, not that she shouldn't have been redeemed, but the process should have been taken more seriously and detailed over a longer period of time. Of course, this is all just a theory, but that's my way of making sense of some of these writing choices. These forced opportunities to make the traveler spend alone time with some women while they're in a vulnerable state, and these instances of these women's potentially interesting flaws being pushed under the rug feel like they're part of a marketing strategy, since character attachment is the driver of revenue earning for this game. There's probably more to discuss here, but yes, I narrowed it down for the sake of the video because I do believe there are other better things to talk about, especially involving Xianyun. So, the reason why I use her as an example of a stark improvement in writing Genshin women is that, well, basically, they're really allowing a middle-aged coded woman a certain degree of vanity, some level of fussiness, and unusual speech patterns to thrive in a cast where youthfulness, sweetness, or energeticness are greatly valued when it comes to female characters. Aside from that, she has a unique arc which I remember a Twitter user describing to be similar to a middle-aged mom having to figure out what to do with her life once her children move out of the house. That's not something you find that often in media, I think, because women still face ageism, so I guess older women's issues don't get featured in the spotlight too much. She also noticeably keeps the same traits from when she was in her crane form. It's just that they're taken more seriously now instead of them being framed as comedic like they were before. Yes, I do think that Cloud Retainer in her crane form was played up for comedy because her voice was echoing and her eyes always looked perpetually enlarged, like they were pure meme material, you know. But without that comedic framing, now that she's in the form of a beautiful woman, we can better see that underneath that layer of haughtiness that she's been projecting since patch 1.1, she cares deeply for everyone, and that becomes more apparent with her two disciples being full-fledged playable characters on their own. With these two very concrete examples of how effective her mentorship had been, it's undeniable that her influence on others is positive, not just in spite of her quirky traits, but because of them. They created a great blend of her characteristics so that it's not that she's fussy and haughty sometimes and kind sometimes, but these are made to go hand in hand with the way she treats her disciples and even other Liyue citizens who need her help. For instance, because she's overly meticulous and cares for Ganyu and Shenhe, she makes sure to create top-tier contraptions for them to satisfy their needs and wants, like when Ganyu desired toys when she was still a child, and when Shenhe was looking forward to lifting a Xiao lantern into the sky during last year's lantern rite. even her complicated explanations of mechanics aren't exclusively meant for her to brag about her knowledge, but she also attempts to impart her knowledge to whoever is asking her, and it's their fault that they get bored from what she's talking about. The writers were able to communicate to us that her traits, which can initially seem annoying, can be thought of as strengths in the right contexts, instead of them trying to push her strong personality under the rug for the sake of making her more approachable or appealing right off the bat. While yes, she still shares the typical female character struggle of dealing with loneliness, it's not approached by way of just making the traveler interact with her more. Rather, the solution to her struggle that we're presented with is her making the courageous move to leave her comfort zone behind and reside in Liyue Harbor. This way, she not only ceases to be lonely, but she experiences a shift in perspective about human society and the role of adepti. Perhaps it's no longer necessary that they shun themselves from the rest of Liyue simply because they're higher beings, especially when they share a lot of traits and aspirations with these humans and have been working to preserve them for millennia. What's also interesting is that part of what convinced her to move to Liyue Harbor was the fact that her two disciples did the same, prompting her to wonder what about the place drew them to it. So it gave her the opportunity to learn from them just as they learned from her in the past. And it's really endearing to see that it's their company she actually yearns for, showing her incredibly motherly bond with her disciples, even though she wasn't their real mother, and showing that it's not only the traveler who can cure loneliness for several female characters plus Shao. I think that her rather unique characterization is partly due to the very unique build-up towards her becoming a playable character that I don't think can be replicated in the game easily. Since 2020, she only appeared as a bird, save for a cutscene in the 2023 Lantern Rite, relegating her to being an NPC, which is why the writers didn't need to worry about encouraging players to pull for her because for so many years, she wasn't playable anyway. Because of that, I think they felt freer to give her these traits that were a mix of wise, absurd, and comedic, not caring about targeting an ideal perception from the player base. So now that she became playable, they naturally retained these characteristics of hers and simply gave us more insight on them. That's why I think that freeing a female character from the constraints of marketability allows the writers to come up with very unique ideas for personalities, motivations, and behaviors that represent the real-life female experience more authentically in its many forms. Although I'm highlighting Xianyun in particular as an example of well-executed female character writing, I wouldn't say she's the sole exception because she's part of a recent trend of Genshin women being portrayed in a more realistic, well-rounded, and insightful manner. I simply used her as an example because I found the middle-aged vibes to be the most refreshing, and she's a new character too. Some examples of women's writing improving a bit would be Dia and Navia from the past two Archon quests, who exhibited a strong will along with kindness, but were also allowed to express resentments towards the people who hurt them, like Dia being wary of the academia and her late father, and Navia feeling wronged by the justice system that failed her father. These make them feel more relatable and also help us to think more deeply about social and personal issues, as well as ways to address them. Aside from those two, we have Faruzan, who also has a grandma-like personality, expressing her thoughts about the research environment strongly, and there's Charlotte, who eloquently explained her sense of purpose as a journalist even as Fontaine was about to sink. Of course, Furina's complicated emotions were all touched upon, and the feelings of Poison's residents towards her were addressed somehow compared to Raiden not receiving any backlash for her ruling decisions at all. As for Nilu, she still sort of felt constrained with her expression of negative emotions, but she did learn to debate, so that was some interesting development at least. Anyway, those are just a few. examples, and it's not just the women from the past to our conquests. I think there have always been women who were written very interestingly before and just needed some more time to shine, and the game has devised some ways for them to do so, like with the 2.8 Golden Apple Archipelago that cleared up the personal struggles of previously underrated women such as Mona, Fischl, and Xianyun. Well, it was just a limited time event, but at least it's available online and it contains content to fuel better character analysis. With one of my favorite characters of all time, Lisa, she did have a date format quest with a traveler at first, but in the Vinelazefest event, her skin event, the Windbloom Festival, and even Klee's bomb blasting event, we get to see that she's more interested in spending time with the younger generation to mentor them, so we get a better sense of her demeanor and inclinations. Even Ganyu and Shenhe come across as more interesting now due to their involvement with Xianyun. They did have some interesting story points in the past, but we now get a better idea of Ganyu's will, since the way Xianyun talks about it, it's as if she moved to Liyue Harbor and took up work out of her own volition, and it makes sense since contracts are mutual agreements and not pure orders anyway. As for Shenhe, we find her taking on a new job which she seems to find fulfillment in doing, showing how she's gradually integrating into human society. I think this also demonstrates how interactions among women, whether intergenerationally or as part of friend groups, can be uplifting to the women involved, and I think the writers should attempt to do this more in the future, aside from their current practice of pairing up two best friends, which is great since it's good for shipping, but larger networks of interactions among women will also be much appreciated. Plus, revisiting female characters who were released earlier and adding or updating their arcs naturally produces good results, so I hope that the game continues this forward. Still, I don't think it's completely easy to execute because the game also seems to have given up on some women. Like Kokomi appeared in the Velurium Mirage, but her presence was hardly impactful because the story focused mainly on Idia. A also doesn't get much opportunity for further development considering the writers don't care to really make her go out in public and interact with people all that much, aside from some very short instances that hardly say much about her anyway, especially what she thinks of her nation. However, still acts like Kujosara never existed, so I'm not entirely optimistic about cases like these, but I do hope that the writers will do something about it so as not to waste previously built up potential, especially since I do believe that these female characters were not always horrible to begin with, they just need a push to become better. Speaking of what the writers can do, I think they should just try to care less about curating this sort of Little Miss Perfect female character that can serve as waifus for the player, and write them naturally, taking inspiration from women they know in real life. Xianyun is proof that even if you write a woman with some odd traits that can potentially be construed as annoying, if you approach her arc with sincerity, the result is really satisfying. Plus, if a female character is designed well, people will pull regardless, so there's no need for the writers to walk on eggshells anymore. And it's worth noting that even the most typical cishet gamer dudes are able to appreciate women who aren't completely gentle or optimistic. I think the writers are learning their lesson though because of the recent improvements I've described, and the newly drip-marketed character Chiori does seem to have a very strong diva-like personality, which may be a hit or miss to some fans, but is still very much worth depicting. But I also want to make it clear that the solution isn't solely to create female characters who are not feminine, not gentle, not optimistic. That's just a superficial approach and will only end up producing edgier women who are still shallow if they hardly appear and just continue to say things to keep up their edgy persona instead of generating new insights. The key is really to make them well-rounded, to not be afraid of portraying authenticity, and to come up with refreshing story beats that will keep fans interested. So, with the writers recently succeeding in their attempts to portray a haughty but well-intentioned woman discovering a new way to living life, I hope that would inspire them to come up with new struggles aside from overwork, loneliness, and self-consciousness, or update these issues and tailor them to different contexts or solve them in different ways. That way, I think we'll have many more engaging women to come, just like Xianyun, who soars into the sky unfettered. If you like this video, I hope you could consider subscribing if you haven't already, and do feel free to share your reactions and go through my older content in the meantime, and I'll catch you next time.